I never thought my life would turn into something out of a daytime soap opera. For the longest time, I believed my marriage was as solid as the business empire I spent years building. My wife, Amanda, was the kind of woman people envied. Beautiful, charming, and always full of energy. If you saw her, you'd think, damn, this guy's lucky. And I was lucky, or at least I thought so, until I started noticing things. Little things. The kind of things you don't think twice about at first, but when you put them together, they start painting a different picture. It all started with my business trips. I co-own a thriving construction business with my partner, Greg. The nature of our work meant I was often on the road, negotiating deals, overseeing projects, and shaking hands with new investors. Greg and I had built the business from the ground up, turning it into a name people respected. I trusted him implicitly. He wasn't just my business partner. He was my friend. Amanda had always been understanding of my absences. She ran the house like a pro, took care of our daughter, and managed to always look put together when I came home. The perfect wife, my colleagues often teased me. And for the longest time, I wore that badge with pride. But then, things changed. It began subtly, so much so that I shrugged it off. Amanda had always been affectionate, but one night, when I returned from a 3-day trip to Chicago, she was different. Distant. She barely looked at me as she greeted me at the door. Our 2-year-old, Lila, ran into my arms, but Amanda, she just stood there fidgeting with the sleeve of her shirt. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Of course," she replied with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You must be exhausted. Dinner's in the oven." I didn't think much of it at first. A rough day maybe, but it kept happening. The coldness, the distracted glances, the sudden text messages she'd brush off as just a group chat. She was always on her phone. One night, while I was lying in bed, I noticed her quietly slip out of the room to take a call. She claimed it was her sister, but her voice was hushed, almost secretive. I didn't question it then, but a knot started to form in my gut, the kind you can't ignore. I began to notice Greg acting differently too. At work, he was more confident, almost cocky. He made snide remarks about me working too hard or missing all the fun. I didn't get it. What fun was there to miss? We were both married men with busy lives. But then it hit me like a freight train. What if Greg knew something I didn't? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Amanda's distant smile and Greg's smug face. The pieces were there, scattered in my mind, and they were starting to come together in ways I didn't like. The next morning, I told Amanda I'd be leaving for another business trip, an unexpected one. Her face lit up with a relief that almost made me sick. "Why are you so eager for me to leave?" I thought. I didn't say anything out loud. Instead, I packed my bags, kissed my daughter goodbye, and left the house. What Amanda didn't know was that I wasn't going anywhere. I spent the first day parked down the street from our house, hidden behind tinted windows. Watching. Waiting. I felt insane, paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening under my nose. By the second day, I was ready to give up, convinced I'd lost my mind. Then, on the third day, my patience paid off. Greg's car pulled into my driveway. I sat there, frozen, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. He wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't allowed to be there. I watched as Amanda opened the front door, her face lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in months. She greeted him like she'd been waiting for him, like he was the one she'd been missing. He kissed her on the cheek. I felt something snap inside me. I don't remember how long I sat there in my car, parked down the street, staring at my own house. Minutes? Hours? Who knows? All I could see was Greg, my friend, my business partner, walking into my home like he owned the place. Amanda welcomed him in with that soft smile she used to reserve just for me. I wanted to charge up the driveway, burst through the door, and rip the truth out of them right then and there. But something held me back. Call it strategy, call it shock. Hell, maybe even cowardice, but I knew I needed more. If I confronted them now, they'd deny it, play me for a fool, and I'd be left standing there like an idiot. No, I needed proof. Real proof. Something they couldn't explain away. My mind raced as I watched the curtains in the living room shift slightly. The thought of what might be happening behind those windows made my stomach churn, but I swallowed it down. I started the car and drove away, slowly, methodically, just in case either of them happened to glance outside. I didn't go far, just a few blocks away, to an empty parking lot where I could think. My pulse was still racing, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The betrayal sat heavy in my chest, like someone had driven a knife in and twisted it for good measure. This wasn't just anyone. This was Amanda, the woman I'd built a life with. And Greg, someone I'd trusted like a brother. I needed a plan. By the time I pulled into my driveway that evening, I had it all figured out. I stepped inside, feigning exhaustion from my business trip. Amanda was in the kitchen, humming softly to herself as she prepared dinner. She turned when she saw me, that practiced smile plastered across her face. "You're back early," she said, her voice light, but with just a hint of surprise. "Yeah," I replied casually, dropping my bag by the door. Things wrapped up quicker than expected. I stepped forward and kissed her on the cheek. I couldn't help but notice the faint smell of Greg's cologne lingering on her, and it nearly made me gag. But I kept my composure. I had to play this right. "How was everything here?" I asked. "Fine," she said a little too quickly. "Lila's been great as always. Nothing much to report." I nodded, forcing a smile. "Good. I missed you both." That night, while Amanda slept soundly beside me, I was wide awake, staring at the ceiling. I couldn't shake the image of her with Greg. How comfortable they looked together. Like it wasn't the first time he'd been in my house when I wasn't around. The anger I felt earlier had turned into something colder, sharper. It was no longer just a burst of rage. It was a steady, focused determination. I wasn't going to let them get away with this. If they wanted to play games, fine. I'd show them what happens when you betray the wrong man. The next day, I called up an old friend of mine, a guy named Ray, who worked in private investigations. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but when I explained the situation, he didn't hesitate. "I'll take care of it," he said. "Give me a week, and I'll have all the proof you need." That week was hell. Amanda continued on like nothing was wrong, laughing, smiling, kissing me goodnight. Every touch from her felt like poison, but I endured it. I played my part. At work, Greg acted the same as always, joking around, talking about projects, even making plans for our next big expansion. The audacity of it made my blood boil. I kept my cool, though. I had to. On the fifth day, Ray called me. "You need to come see this," he said, his voice tight. "It's worse than you think." Ray's office was a small, nondescript space in a strip mall on the edge of town. I parked outside, my hands clammy as I gripped the steering wheel. I knew I was about to see something I couldn't unsee, but I had no choice. I had to know. When I walked in, Ray was sitting at his desk, a laptop open in front of him. He looked up, his expression serious. "Take a seat, Jack," he said. He turned the laptop toward me. This was 2 days ago. On the screen, I saw Greg's car pulling into my driveway again. A hidden camera Ray had set up across the street captured everything in crystal clear detail. I watched as Amanda opened the front door, looking happier than she'd looked in months. Greg stepped out of the car, a cocky grin on his face, and handed her a bouquet of flowers. Flowers. My stomach twisted. The next video showed them inside the house, on the couch where Amanda and I used to sit together and watch movies. They were laughing, talking, then kissing. It escalated from there, and I had to look away. Ray didn't say anything, just let the footage speak for itself. After a minute, he spoke up. "There's more." I shook my head, trying to breathe. "I've seen enough." "Jack," Ray said carefully, "there's one other thing. Something you need to know." He pulled up a file, documents, birth certificates, and medical records. He slid them across the desk to me. I picked them up, my hands trembling as I read the results. Lila, my little girl, my beautiful 2-year-old daughter. Except she wasn't mine. My heart stopped. The paper blurred as tears welled in my eyes. According to the DNA test Ray had somehow managed to obtain, Lila was Greg's, not mine. The betrayal I felt before was nothing compared to this. It wasn't just my marriage, my business, my trust. They'd stolen my family, my daughter. I set the papers down and looked up at Ray. My voice was eerily calm when I spoke. "Thanks, Ray. I'll take it from here." "What are you going to do?" he asked cautiously. I stood, buttoning my coat, and slipping the documents into my pocket. "Don't worry," I said, turning to leave. "I'll make sure they get what they deserve." Walking out of Ray's office felt like stepping into a different world. The sky was the same dull gray. People moved about their lives obliviously, but for me, everything had shifted. My entire existence, my marriage, my family, my partnership, was a lie. Amanda and Greg had ripped everything from me, piece by piece, while I was too blind to see it. But now I knew, and they had no idea what was coming. I spent the rest of the day in my truck, parked in a quiet lot, thinking through my next moves. Revenge wasn't just a passing thought. It was a promise. I wasn't about to let Greg and Amanda waltz off into their happily ever after at my expense. They'd taken my trust, my dignity, and my daughter. They were going to pay. All I had to do was set the trap. That evening, I returned home as if nothing had happened. I stepped through the door with a calm smile plastered on my face, though it felt more like a mask now. Amanda was in the kitchen, stirring something in a pot. The smell of tomato sauce hung in the air. "Welcome home," she said cheerfully, barely glancing up. The sound of her voice made my skin crawl. "Hey," I replied, walking up to her. I kissed the top of her head. Habit. Nothing more before stepping back. "What's for dinner?" "Pasta. I figured you'd be tired tonight, so I kept it simple." "How thoughtful." I gritted my teeth and nodded. "Thanks. Where's Lila?" "She's napping upstairs." Amanda turned to face me, her soft smile meeting mine. "How was your trip?" "Good," I said smoothly. "Productive." She nodded, returning to her cooking. I watched her carefully, every gesture, every glance, looking for cracks, for signs of guilt. But she played her role perfectly, as if she were just another loving wife preparing dinner for her husband. I wondered how long she'd been doing this, lying to my face, sharing her body with my business partner, and pretending everything was fine. It made me sick, but I played along. I had to. Over the next couple of days, I put my plan into motion. First, I started working late, or at least that's what I told Amanda. Big project, I'd say, shaking my head like a man under pressure. "Gonna be late tonight." She'd smile sympathetically and tell me not to overdo it. Little did she know I was spending those nights gathering everything I needed. I went through Greg's business emails, uncovering some questionable side deals he'd been orchestrating behind my back. All it took was a little digging to find evidence of misappropriated funds, money he'd siphoned from our joint accounts to fuel his own personal ventures. I had proof of every dollar. Then there was Amanda. I went through her phone while she was in the shower one night, using the cloning software Ray had recommended. Texts, photos, even voicemails, it was all there. I found the messages to Greg. "Miss you. Can't wait until we're together again. He's leaving for another trip soon. You know what that means." Winky face. "Lila looks so much like you. It's crazy." That one nearly broke me. But instead of letting the anger consume me, I saved the message. I saved everything. Screenshots, call logs, dates, times. I wasn't just going to confront them. I was going to destroy them. On Friday night, I set the final stage of my plan. Amanda and I were sitting in the living room after dinner. Lila was asleep upstairs. The air felt heavy with unspoken words, but Amanda didn't seem to notice. She scrolled through her phone absent-mindedly, while I pretended to read a newspaper. "Hey," I said casually, setting the paper down. "Greg called me earlier. Said he wanted to have dinner with us tomorrow. Just the three of us." Her head snapped up. For a split second, I saw it, the panic in her eyes, but she quickly masked it with a smile. "Oh, that's nice of him." "Yeah," I said, holding her gaze. "We got a lot to talk about." She didn't respond right away. "What kind of things?" "Business stuff," I said with a shrug. "You know how it is." Amanda forced another smile, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. "Good. Let her sweat." The next evening, Greg showed up right on time, all smiles and fake charm. He was holding a bottle of wine, a peace offering, I'm sure, as he walked into my house like he belonged there. "Jack," he said, shaking my hand. "It's been a while. Thanks for having me over." "No problem, Greg," I replied coolly, forcing a smile. "Make yourself at home." Amanda sat on the couch, quiet and stiff. I could tell she was nervous. She glanced at me more than once, probably wondering what I was up to. Good. We sat in the living room, making small talk. Greg talked about work, Amanda forced laughter at his jokes, and I just sat there, watching them both with a cold, steady calm. Finally, I stood up. Let's have dinner. I've got something special to show you too. Greg raised an eyebrow. Special? You'll see. I led them into the dining room, where I had set everything up perfectly. The table was laid out beautifully, candles, plates, silverware polished to a shine. But it wasn't the dinner that was important. It was the laptop sitting at the head of the table, its screen open and waiting. Amanda froze when she saw it. "What's this?" Greg asked, his tone shifting. "Go ahead," I said, gesturing to the screen. "Press play." Greg looked at me, then at Amanda, before slowly moving forward. He clicked the spacebar, and the video started. It was all there. The footage Ray had captured. Greg and Amanda in my house, on my couch, tangled up in each other. The sound of their laughter, their whispered promises, it filled the room like poison. I watched Greg's face go pale. Amanda covered her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. I stood at the other end of the table, my arms crossed. "Surprise," I said quietly. Greg stumbled back from the laptop. "Jack, I can explain." "Explain what?" I snapped, my voice cold. "Explain how you betrayed me? How you slept with my wife in my own home? How you fathered my daughter?" Amanda burst into tears. "Jack, please." "Shut up," I barked, glaring at her. "You don't get to speak." Greg looked like he wanted to run, but I wasn't done yet. "You think you can steal from me?" I hissed, stepping closer to him. "You think you can take everything I built and walk away unscathed?" I reached into my pocket and tossed a stack of papers onto the table, evidence of Greg's financial fraud. His eyes darted over the documents, his face crumpling. "You're finished," I said quietly. "Both of you. You know that moment when silence feels heavier than words?" That was the dining room. Amanda, eyes wide and bloodshot, had stopped sobbing. Greg looked like a man staring down the barrel of a loaded gun, frozen, pale, and teetering on the edge of panic. I leaned back against the doorway, arms crossed, watching them squirm. "So," I said finally, my voice calm and steady. "Who wants to start?" Amanda opened her mouth first. "Jack, please. This isn't what it looks like." I laughed. I actually laughed. A sharp, bitter sound that echoed off the walls. "Not what it looks like. Amanda, I just showed you video proof. I saw you. I heard you. You don't get to insult me by playing stupid." She flinched, her shoulders sagging. I turned to Greg, who still hadn't said a word. "What about you, Greg? Nothing to say? Cat got your tongue." Greg finally found his voice. "Jack, listen, man, this got out of hand. I never meant for..." "Never meant for what?" I interrupted sharply, pushing off the wall and walking toward him. "To sleep with my wife? To father my daughter? Behind my back? Or maybe you're talking about siphoning money from our business to fund whatever else you've been doing." I slammed my hand down on the table. "Which part didn't you mean, Greg?" He looked like a deer caught in headlights, stumbling over his words. I screwed up, okay? But it doesn't have to be like this." I held up my hand, cutting him off. "Stop. Just stop." My voice was dangerously low. "You don't get to bargain. You don't get to reason. You threw this all away when you decided to spit in my face." Amanda sobbed harder. "Please, Jack. I know I messed up." "I messed up." I rounded on her now, fury bubbling under my skin. "You ruined everything, Amanda. Everything. You lied to me. You made a fool out of me. And worst of all, you let me love a child who isn't even mine." The words were barely out of my mouth before Amanda's face crumpled. "Lila is yours, Jack. She's yours in every way that matters. Except biologically," I snapped. "And you knew. You knew, and you let me think she was mine. You smiled at me every day and let me live in your lie." She tried to move toward me, but I stepped back, holding up a hand. "Don't." Greg, likely sensing an opportunity to save his own neck, tried to step in. "Jack, let's talk about this. We can figure it out like adults." I turned to him, my voice ice cold. "Greg, I'm going to ruin you. You and Amanda. And there's nothing you can say to stop me." I left them sitting there, too stunned to follow, and retreated to my office upstairs. I needed a moment to breathe, to collect myself. The rage was still there, hot and consuming, but it was tempered now by something sharper: control. The truth was, I had already made my moves. I'd forwarded every shred of Greg's financial fraud to our corporate lawyer that morning, along with the recordings and screenshots proving his affair with Amanda. By Monday, Greg would be ousted from the company, and I'd make sure he left with nothing. Not his shares, not his reputation, not even his dignity. Amanda wouldn't fare much better. I had already spoken to my lawyer, who assured me the evidence of her infidelity was airtight. Divorce proceedings would begin immediately, and thanks to a carefully worded prenup I'd insisted on before we got married, she'd leave with exactly what she brought into the marriage: nothing. As for Lila, the thought of her sent a dull ache through my chest. I loved her. I couldn't just turn that off. She was innocent in all this. She didn't choose to be Greg's daughter. But I couldn't look at her the same way anymore. Knowing what I knew, I didn't know what the future held there, but I did know one thing: Amanda wasn't going to use her to manipulate me. By the time I came back downstairs, Greg was gone. Amanda sat alone on the couch, staring blankly at the floor. I stopped in the doorway, crossing my arms. "Where is he?" I asked. "I told him to leave," she whispered. I wanted to talk to you." "There's nothing to talk about." "Jack, please." She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. "I know you hate me right now, but don't do this. Don't throw everything away." I laughed bitterly. "I'm throwing everything away?" "Amanda, you did that the moment you let him into my house. Into our bed. You don't get to play the victim here." "I love you, Jack," she cried, her voice breaking. "I made a mistake, but it doesn't change how I feel about you." "Love," I repeated, my voice low. "You don't love me, Amanda. You love the comfort, the security, the life I gave you. You didn't love me. If you did, you wouldn't have done this." Her lip trembled, and she fell silent. I stared at her for a long moment, feeling nothing but emptiness. The woman I thought I knew was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. "I want you out," I said finally, my voice steady. "Pack your things and leave. Tonight." "Jack, I'm done." My voice hardened. "Take your lies, your betrayal, and get out of my house." Amanda packed quietly, her sobs the only sound in the house. I stayed downstairs, listening to every drawer open and close, every rustle of clothing, every shuffle of footsteps. I wanted to make sure she didn't take anything that wasn't hers. When she came down the stairs an hour later, her face was pale and streaked with tears. She carried a single suitcase. The rest of her things could be dealt with later. She stopped by the front door, looking back at me one last time. "What about Lila?" she whispered. "We'll figure it out," I said coldly. "Through the lawyers." She nodded, knowing better than to push. "I'm sorry, Jack." I didn't answer. I just opened the door for her. She stepped outside, her shoulders slumped, and walked to her car. I watched as she drove away, the tail lights disappearing into the night. When I closed the door, the silence that followed felt deafening. The house, once filled with laughter and love, now felt like a tomb. I stood there for a long time, staring at nothing. The quiet in the house wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. After Amanda left that night, I stood in the middle of the living room, staring at the empty space where her bags used to be. The clock ticked loudly from the mantel, a sound I'd never noticed before, like it was mocking me. I should have felt victorious. I'd kicked her out. I'd set the wheels in motion to destroy Greg. Everything was going according to plan. But the truth? I didn't feel anything. I felt hollow, like someone had carved out my insides and left me to walk around in my own skin. It was nearly midnight when I forced myself to move. I poured a glass of whiskey and sank into the leather chair in my office, the weight of everything finally settling on me. Lila, my little girl, who wasn't my little girl. I had read the DNA results a dozen times already, hoping the words would somehow change. They never did. The next morning, I went to work as if nothing had happened. I had no choice. The business still needed to run, and I couldn't afford to let anyone see cracks in my armor. Not yet. My assistant, Janine, greeted me at the door with her usual efficiency. Good morning, Mr. Hayes. Greg called. He said he's feeling unwell today and won't be coming in. Is that so? I said, forcing a smile. Must be something serious. Janine nodded sympathetically. Shall I reschedule your meeting with him for next week? Don't worry about it, I said. Greg and I will sort things out soon enough. And we would. I was making sure of that. I spent the rest of the day tying up loose ends. By now, the lawyers were already on Greg's trail, digging into his finances, uncovering every shady transaction he'd buried. I'd also sent everything to the company board, along with a personal recommendation. Greg needed to be removed immediately. No one could argue with the evidence. By next week, he'd be stripped of his position, humiliated in front of everyone who ever respected him. But it wasn't enough. I couldn't stop thinking about him in my house, with Amanda laughing at my expense. That night, as I sat alone in the kitchen nursing another glass of whiskey, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Amanda. Amanda, can we talk? Please. You need to hear me out. I stared at the screen, my jaw clenching. Another message popped up. Amanda, Lila's asking for you. She misses her daddy. I nearly threw the phone across the room. Instead, I picked it up and called her. She answered on the second ring, her voice soft. Jack! Don't! I snapped. Don't use her against me. I'm not. Jack, please, she said, her voice cracking. You have every right to hate me, but Lila doesn't understand what's happening. She's asking for you. She needs you. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I closed my eyes, pinching the bridge of my nose. What do you want, Amanda? I just want to talk. Face to face. Please. I hesitated. Every instinct in me screamed no. But then I thought about Lila, her little giggle when she'd run into my arms, the way she'd snuggle against me on the couch after a long day. Fine, I said finally. Tomorrow. Noon. My lawyer's office. Your lawyer? She repeated, clearly taken aback. That's right, I said coldly. If you want to talk, we're doing this the right way. I hung up before she could say anything else. The next day, I walked into the lawyer's office with the kind of calm I had to force. Amanda was already there, sitting in the waiting room with a small, nervous smile. I ignored it, brushing past her as my lawyer, Carl, led us into the conference room. We sat at opposite ends of the table. Amanda looked smaller than I remembered, her hands trembling slightly as she pushed her hair behind her ear. Thank you for coming, she said softly. Let's cut the crap, Amanda, I said flatly. What do you want? I want to explain, she said, her voice shaking. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. God knows I don't. But I need you to understand why. Why you cheated on me with my business partner? I asked, my tone sharp. Why you lied to me about Lila? Go ahead. Enlighten me. Tears welled in her eyes, but I didn't feel an ounce of sympathy. Not anymore. It started when you began traveling so much, she said quietly. I was lonely, Jack. You were always gone, and when you were home, it felt like you weren't really there. So that's your excuse? I shot back. I worked my ass off to give you and Lila a good life, and you repaid me by crawling into bed with Greg? She winced, tears spilling down her cheeks. I didn't plan for any of this to happen. I didn't want this, Jack. I love you. Love? I laughed bitterly. You call this love? Amanda, you had his child. You let me think she was mine. I thought you were, she whispered, her voice cracking. At first, but when Greg found out, he insisted on a test. I didn't know what to do. I was scared of losing everything. I slammed my hands on the table, startling her. So you let me raise her. You let me love her. You let me believe I had a family. I'm sorry, she sobbed. I never wanted to hurt you. For a long moment, the room was silent except for Amanda's quiet crying. I sat there, staring at the woman I used to love, and felt nothing but disgust. You want to talk? I said finally, my voice low and controlled. Fine, here's what's going to happen. I laid it out for her, calm, clear, and brutal. The divorce papers were already being drawn up. She would leave with nothing, just as the prenup stated. As for Lila, I wasn't making any promises. The courts would decide what happened there. Amanda stared at me, her face crumpling with every word. Jack, please, don't take her from me. That's not up to me, I said coldly. You did this, Amanda. You. When I left the office, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel satisfied. I felt empty, like the anger that had been driving me was gone, leaving nothing behind. I climbed into my truck and sat there for a long time, staring at the steering wheel. I'd won, or at least I was on my way to winning. Greg would lose everything. Amanda was out of my life for good. But as I sat there in the silence, one thought kept haunting me. What about Lila? The drive home from my lawyer's office felt endless. My thoughts were a whirlwind. Amanda's sobbing face, the weight of her betrayal, and Lila. Always Lila. I had a plan. Everything was in motion. Amanda would lose everything, Greg would be ruined, and I'd come out on top. But no amount of revenge could change the truth. The little girl who called me daddy wasn't mine. When I pulled into the driveway, I just sat there gripping the steering wheel. My house, our house, felt different now. Empty. Even though it was still filled with the furniture Amanda had picked out, the photos of us smiling from years gone by, and the toys scattered around Lila's play corner. I walked in and shut the door behind me, the silence pressing down on my chest like a weight. I poured myself a drink, something stronger than I usually went for, because I knew I'd need it. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. I groaned, shielding my eyes from the sunlight streaming through the blinds, and grabbed it. It was a text from Greg. Greg, we need to talk. Don't do this, Jack. You're making a mistake. A mistake? I nearly crushed the phone in my hand. The nerve of him, to act like I was the problem in all this. I fired off a reply. Me, I don't talk to traitors. You'll get my message soon enough. I sat up, rubbing my hands over my face. My head throbbed from last night's whiskey, but I didn't care. If Greg thought he could weasel his way out of this, he was wrong. I wasn't backing down. I'd worked too hard to build this life. And he thought he could just steal it all out from under me, my wife, my trust, even my daughter? Not a chance. At the office that day, I focused on finishing Greg. I called Janine into my office. Get the board together for an emergency meeting tomorrow morning, I said. Janine frowned, adjusting her glasses. Is everything okay, Mr. Hayes? Better than ever, I replied coolly. I'm just tying up a few loose ends. She nodded, though I could tell she wanted to ask more. I didn't give her the chance. I turned to my computer and began drafting an email to the board, attaching every document I had, proof of Greg's financial fraud, screenshots of the texts between him and Amanda, and even the photos Ray had sent me. By the time I hit send, I felt like I'd set a bomb in Greg's life that was just waiting to go off. That night, Amanda called me. I ignored her at first, but when she called a second time, I finally picked up. What? I said sharply. Jack, she said softly. I need to see you. Please. Just for a minute. I don't want to see you, Amanda. Please, Jack. It's about Lila. Hearing her name made my heart twist. What about her? She's asking for you. She doesn't understand why you're not here anymore. She cries herself to sleep at night calling for her daddy. Please, just come see her. I clenched my jaw, my chest tightening. You don't get to use her to manipulate me. I'm not, she cried. You love her, Jack. And she loves you. None of this is her fault. That hit me harder than I cared to admit. I sat there, silent, gripping the phone. Please, she whispered. For her. I hung up without answering. I didn't sleep much that night. Amanda's words echoed in my head. She cries herself to sleep calling for her daddy. I wanted to shut it out, to ignore her, but I couldn't. I kept seeing Lila's face. Her bright little smile when I'd pick her up, the way she'd snuggle into my chest during bedtime stories, whispering, I love you, Daddy. She didn't ask to be born into this mess. None of this was her fault. Around 2 a.m., I finally gave in. I got dressed, grabbed my keys, and drove across town to the small apartment Amanda had moved into after I kicked her out. The lights were still on when I pulled up, and I sat there for a minute, staring at the door, trying to gather myself. What the hell am I doing here? I thought, but deep down I already knew. Amanda answered the door, looking like she hadn't slept in days. Her face was pale, her eyes red and swollen. She didn't say anything, just stepped aside and let me in. The apartment was small and bare, nothing like the house we used to share. Lila's toys were scattered across the floor, and a tiny pair of shoes sat neatly by the door. Seeing them made my throat tighten. "She's asleep," Amanda said quietly. "In the bedroom." I nodded, walking past her to the small room down the hall. I pushed the door open gently, my heart catching in my throat. There she was, Lila, curled up in her tiny bed, her thumb in her mouth, her cheeks streaked with dried tears. Her stuffed bunny was tucked under her arm, the same one I'd given her on her first birthday. I knelt down beside her, brushing a lock of hair from her face. She stirred slightly, blinking up at me through sleepy eyes. "Daddy," she whispered. "Hey, baby girl," I said softly, my voice breaking. "I'm here." Her little arms reached up for me, and I lifted her into my arms, holding her close. She nestled against my chest with a contented sigh, like she'd been waiting for this moment. "I missed you," she mumbled, already drifting back to sleep. Tears stung my eyes as I held her, rocking her gently. I'd been so focused on revenge, on destroying Greg and Amanda, that I'd forgotten what mattered most. Lila didn't care about DNA tests or betrayals. To her, I was her daddy, and as much as it hurt to know the truth, I couldn't turn my back on her. Amanda stood in the doorway, watching us. I didn't look at her. I couldn't. I stayed there for hours, holding Lila as she slept, listening to her soft breaths. For the first time in weeks, the anger started to fade, replaced by something else: grief, acceptance, and a faint glimmer of hope. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. No matter what happened between me, Amanda, or Greg, I wasn't going to lose Lila. She was mine, blood or not. By the time the sun rose, I was still sitting there in that small, unfamiliar room with Lila asleep in my arms. I couldn't bring myself to move. For hours, I had gone back and forth in my mind, wrestling with the truth of her paternity and what it meant for me. Blood might have bound her to Greg, but she didn't know that. To her, I was her father, the one who rocked her to sleep when she had nightmares, who kissed her scraped knees, who made her pancakes shaped like animals on Saturday mornings. None of Greg's betrayal could change that. But this wasn't just about Lila. The anger I'd bottled up had nowhere to go anymore. I couldn't keep pretending I was fine. Amanda's betrayal still burned deep, and Greg, my so-called friend, had yet to feel the full weight of what he'd done. I kissed Lila's forehead and gently placed her back in bed, tucking her stuffed bunny under her arm. I stayed there a moment longer, just watching her, before I turned and quietly left the room. Amanda was waiting in the kitchen, sitting at the small table with a cup of coffee cradled in her hands. She looked up when she saw me, her face still pale from the night before. "She missed you," she said softly. I ignored her and grabbed my keys from the counter. "Don't mistake this for forgiveness," I said, my voice cold. "I came here for her, not you." Amanda nodded, her eyes glistening. "I know. I don't expect forgiveness, Jack. Her voice broke. "Thank you for coming." I didn't respond. I walked out the door and left her sitting there, the quiet of the apartment swallowing her whole. Back at the house, I showered and dressed for work, knowing today would be the day Greg's life imploded. As I knotted my tie, I felt that cold determination settle back over me, steadying me. This wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. By the time I arrived at the office, the board members were already gathering for the emergency meeting I'd called. I strode through the hallways with purpose, ignoring the nervous glances of employees who had clearly heard whispers of what was about to happen. Greg was there already, sitting at the far end of the conference table with his laptop open in front of him. He looked up as I entered, his smug grin faltering when he saw the look on my face. "Morning, Jack," he said, trying to sound casual. "What's all this about?" I didn't respond. I took my seat at the head of the table as the rest of the board settled in. My lawyer, Carl, sat to my left, a thick folder of documents in front of him. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," I began, my voice steady. "There's an issue we need to address. It involves one of our partners, Greg Martin." Greg stiffened slightly, his eyes darting around the table. "What's this about, Jack?" he repeated, his tone more defensive now. I ignored him and opened the folder, pulling out the first stack of documents. Over the past 6 months, Greg has been embezzling funds from our company accounts to finance unauthorized side ventures. I provided the board with evidence of these transactions, including falsified invoices and diverted payments. Gasps rippled through the room as I passed the documents down the table. Greg's face went pale. "What the hell is this, Jack?" he sputtered. "This is bullshit." "Language," Carl said smoothly, adjusting his tie. "The evidence speaks for itself, Mr. Martin." "I trusted you, Greg," I said, my voice low and cutting. "I brought you into this business. We built this together, and this is how you repay me?" "You're out of your mind," Greg shot back, his face red now. "This is a setup." "It's not," Carl interjected calmly. "The paper trail is indisputable, and as of this morning, we've already filed a formal complaint with the authorities." Greg's eyes widened. "You did what?" "You're done, Greg," I said. "You're finished here. The board will vote to remove you as partner, and you'll face criminal charges for what you've done." "This isn't about the business, is it?" Greg shouted, rising to his feet. "This is about Amanda. You're pissed because she—" "Don't!" My voice was deadly quiet, but it stopped him mid-sentence. I stood, meeting his furious gaze with cold, unflinching calm. "You don't get to talk about her. You don't get to say her name." The board members sat in stunned silence, watching the scene unfold. Greg's chest heaved as he glared at me, his fists clenched at his sides. "You brought this on yourself," I said, straightening my tie. "Now you'll pay for it." Greg was escorted out of the building by security less than an hour later. I stood in my office window, watching as he stomped across the parking lot, shouting into his phone like a madman. His car peeled out of the lot moments later, the screech of tires echoing off the glass. A hollow satisfaction settled in my chest. Greg was ruined. His reputation, his career, his future, all gone. It should have felt good. It should have felt like justice. But it didn't. Because at the end of the day, I was still standing there alone, watching the wreckage of my life play out in real time. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with another glass of whiskey, staring at the untouched dinner I'd made. The house was too quiet, too empty. My phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a text from Amanda. "Amanda, Lila keeps asking when she'll see you again. She drew a picture of you today. Do you want me to send it?" I stared at the screen, the words blurring as tears stung my eyes. For weeks, I'd been so consumed by anger and revenge that I hadn't let myself feel anything else. But now, sitting in that empty house, I realized what I'd lost. Greg might have been destroyed. Amanda might have been kicked out. But I was the one left with nothing. I set the phone down and buried my face in my hands, the weight of everything crashing down on me at once. For days, the house felt like a ghost town. Every room was silent, but filled with the echoes of what once was. Lila's giggles by the staircase, Amanda's soft hum in the kitchen, the sound of my own laughter when life still felt whole. Now, just emptiness. Greg was done, stripped of his role at the company and facing criminal charges. Amanda was out of my life. I'd set out to destroy them, and I had succeeded. My reputation and business were intact. I won. But what exactly had I won? Lila. Her name tugged at me every time I walked past her empty bedroom. I couldn't escape it. She was innocent in all this. And no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, she was my daughter. Maybe not by blood, but in every way that mattered. She was mine. The turning point came one late afternoon. I'd stopped by my lawyer's office to sign off on a final round of paperwork when Carl handed me an envelope. "What's this?" I asked, confused. "A letter from Amanda," Carl said carefully. "She asked me to give it to you once everything's settled." I turned it over in my hands, hesitating. I wasn't sure I wanted to hear anything she had to say, but curiosity got the better of me. Later that night, with a drink in hand, I opened it. "Jack, I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, and I wouldn't blame you if you burned this without reading it. But if there's any part of you left that still loves Lila, I hope you'll hear me out. What I did to you is unforgivable. I destroyed everything we built together because I was selfish, lonely, and weak. I let you believe a lie, and I will carry that guilt for the rest of my life. But there's one thing I need you to know. Lila loves you. She doesn't know Greg. She doesn't know what I've done. All she knows is that you are her daddy, the man who holds her when she cries, who reads her stories at night, who makes her smile when the world feels too big. I won't ask for your forgiveness because I don't deserve it. But I will ask this. Don't punish her for my sins. She's your little girl, Jack. Blood doesn't make a father. Love does. I hope you find peace. And I hope, one day, you'll remember the good we had. Take care of yourself. Amanda. I stared at the letter, Amanda's words blurring in front of me. Blood doesn't make a father. Love does. She was right. I'd spent weeks obsessing over revenge, over the betrayal, over the ways my life had fallen apart. But I hadn't stopped to think about what mattered most. Lila wasn't just Amanda and Greg's mistake. She was my daughter, and I loved her. What the hell was I doing? The next morning, I drove to Amanda's apartment. She opened the door looking wary, like she wasn't sure what to expect. I need to see her, I said. Amanda nodded, stepping aside without a word. Lila was sitting on the living room floor, coloring with her stuffed bunny tucked under her arm. When she looked up and saw me, her face lit up in a way that nearly broke me. "Daddy," she cried, scrambling to her feet and running straight into my arms. I scooped her up, holding her tightly as tears threatened to fall. "Hey, baby girl," I whispered. "I missed you." She pulled back just enough to look at me, her little brow furrowed. "Why didn't you come home?" My throat tightened. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I was figuring some things out, but I'm here now. I promise." "Are you staying?" she asked, her voice small. I glanced at Amanda, who stood silently by the doorway, her eyes red but hopeful. "Yes," I said, turning back to Lila. "I'm not going anywhere." In the weeks that followed, I began to pick up the pieces. The divorce was finalized, and Amanda and I worked out an agreement. I kept the house, the business, and the life I'd built. But more importantly, I kept Lila. At first, the wounds felt impossible to heal. Seeing Amanda was painful, but we learned to coexist for Lila's sake. She didn't need to know the details of what happened. All she needed to know was that she was loved. Greg? I never saw him again. Last I heard, he'd moved out of town, drowning in lawsuits and debt. His name became a whisper, one I no longer cared to hear. One afternoon, months later, I sat on the back porch watching Lila chase Bubbles in the yard. Her laughter rang out through the air, clear and sweet, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I smiled, really smiled. "Daddy, look," she called, holding out her bubble wand. "I see, baby girl." I called back. I leaned back in my chair, the sun warm on my face, and let the past finally drift away. Amanda's betrayal, Greg's lies, the anger that had consumed me, it no longer mattered. What mattered was right here in front of me. Lila, my daughter, my family. Blood be damned. She was mine.